YouTube video can also now pivot because they thought I was probably going to preach from the pulpit and had that camera lined up to be over there, but here I am, right here, standing in the middle. Is that enough time? Cool. So story number one is this. It's a reminder story. A couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, I preached a sermon, and I told you that I had developed a sermon that week. All week long, I'd been working hard and editing this nice, tight, concise 4 pages of a sermon, and then I woke up on Sunday morning and heard that little interior voice of God that was like, hey, throw that one away. That's not it. And then by like 11:15 that Sunday, I finally figured out what I was supposed to preach, which is good. I thought that was a pretty good pattern. Like, if that's what you're going to do, God, to convince me to preach a different sermon, you could do that one again. That's fine. God decided to use a different technology this week to cause the same result to happen. So I'm here in the church yesterday with plenty of other people who are doing flowers and setting up bulletins and doing all the other things going in to make the day happen. And my oldest daughter and I are in the hallway, and we're filling up those balloons to make that little arch as an homage to my predecessor, Henry Harrison, who loved balloons on Pentecost. And we're filling it up, and then somebody who had been in a Bible study that morning came by and said, hey, really interesting choice to not read the story of Pentecost on the Feast of Pentecost. Curious choice, but hey, just, new rectors, they do weird things. And I immediately panicked. I didn't panic, but I thought, how am I going to preach that sermon on the book of Acts if you're going to read Genesis and Romans today? Total oversight. No matter how many times I had proofed the bulletin, I never even thought for a second to pay attention to whether or not we were reading from Acts. So here's the new work that the spirit of chaos apparently is bringing me into, is to preach that sermon today somehow anyway. And it gives me a chance to do a couple things. One is this: the reading's really long, so I get to paraphrase it. I get to talk about it a little bit differently, and I kind of like that. And I get to link it up to Genesis as well, and that's going to be kind of nice. So I want to start here because talking about Pentecost, not only from the historical perspective, but also to help build it out a little bit, because some of you know what Pentecost is, and you've been in church your whole lives knowing what Pentecost is, and some of you don't. And so let me back up a little bit. There was a festival sometimes called Pentecost. It wasn't a Christian festival. It was a Jewish festival. It was the festival of Shavuot, the festival of, or Feast of Weeks. 7 weeks after the Passover, there was a pilgrimage festival where the people would come into Jerusalem again. It was right there in the wheat harvest. And so instead of coming back to Jerusalem to sacrifice lambs like might have happened during Passover, they came with the first fruits of the harvest to offer them in thanksgiving to the God of abundance who had allowed them to have a harvest to begin with. And so, big processional into Jerusalem, into the temple, to do what is a pilgrimage and a religious obligation. That's what happens 50 days, 49 days after Passover. It's in that stretch of time leading up to that feast, Shavuot, that our disciples, our intrepid band of disciples who have witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus, and then met Jesus again after the resurrection, and then watched Jesus disappear before their very eyes, going back to heaven, so to speak, that they are huddled together again, back in a locked room, wondering what is going to happen next, and they are holding on to a promise that Jesus had made them, that Jesus would give them his own Spirit as another advocate, a guide to be with them, to lead them into truth, to give them power for ministry that extends the ministry of Jesus into the next age. That's what they're waiting on as they're huddled together in this room. They are huddled together in this room, and it's kind of quiet in there, but outside, a cacophony of sounds, as well as a strange mixture of people and smells and customs and all sorts of other stuff, because this festival, Shavuot, that's happening, that's bringing millions of people into Jerusalem, is drawing them in, as Acts tells us, from all over the place. One of my favorite parts of that reading, apart from the part where some people think that the disciples are drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning, is that we get this list of where they're from: Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of the region of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and people from Cappadocia and Phrygia and Pamphylia and all these other places that most of us could never point to on a map anyway. The point is that they're from all over the place and that they all speak different languages. There is something unifying them in the festival that's happening, but otherwise they're pretty divided people. Suddenly, in the room where the disciples are, there's a rushing wind, or something that sounds like that, a violent rushing wind, and they are startled by it. And then they see coming down from above fire, or something that looks like fire, and little tongues of fire like the tops of candles are kind of hovering above each person's head. I've been told that I should look up here, because that apparently is depicted in one of these stained glass windows. Is it up here? Oh, there they are. Yeah, little red. I'm sorry, I was having trouble finding the fire. There's the dove, right? That's what they're seeing. That's what they're hearing. And then they hear more. As they are listening, they begin to hear that the speech of the disciples has changed. That either in a miracle of God granting them a gift for a new language, or in a miracle of them hearing something new, they hear a new cacophony of languages being spoken in the room. The gift of that Spirit that Jesus had promised them was there. And as they go out from that place, they find out that all of these other people who are in town have gathered around, not all of them, many of them, because they also heard that rushing wind, and they're so curious as to what's happening. And now the disciples have a chance to proclaim what Jesus has been up to, what God has been up to in Jesus for the last 50 days or 3 years. And people can hear it in the native language of each. It's an extraordinary story, and it's one that has a number of themes that I want to pick up on relatively briefly. One of those is the way in which immediately at the very beginning of the gift of the Spirit's work in the church is the power to cross boundaries of division for the proclamation of God's loving work. That's a mouthful, maybe. Right at the beginning of the Spirit's work in the church is the gift of the power to cross boundaries of division in order to proclaim the loving work of God. It's part of our spiritual DNA, we might say. It's a key to God's salvific work, the work of God's salvation working itself out. We read from Genesis today as a way of going way back to the beginning of the story. The narrator in Genesis tells us that this is how we end up being scattered people with scattered languages. Is that when humanity was getting together in the 11th chapter of Genesis, as we were growing together, we were replicating that fundamental flaw that we had, stretching all the way back to Adam and Eve, to try to supplant God in our pride and in our arrogance, to take our place on the throne of heaven. And every time we got together with our technology and our common language, we found ways to hurt and destroy people as well, in addition to God's creation altogether. Sometimes we might say that not much has changed, a lot has changed. And sometimes that stuff resonates with us because it's trying to point to who we are as people and what God's trying to do about it. So God says, hey, we can't let these folks be together. We'll spread them all over the earth into smaller groups with different languages so they can't collaborate on destruction. God doesn't want us to be divided from one another. It wasn't God's purpose or God's intent or God's design in creation. The rest of the story of the Bible is a story about God trying to gather us back in to be one humanity, united in love as we had been in the beginning. Pentecost. Pentecost is the way in which God has called and equipped the church to do that work. It's not the birthday of the church, though that's a fun way of talking about it. The church had already been gathered, but now the church has been equipped to cross boundaries of division that it might proclaim the loving work of God. I wonder if you feel like that's the work of the church. Or I might say, how's it going, church? Does it feel like we're being empowered by the Spirit of God that we might cross boundaries of division to proclaim the ever-expanding, uncompromising, reconciling love of God to a world that needs to hear it? I'm not so sure all the time. Sometimes I think we're doing great, and sometimes I think we forgot again and again and again. The whole story of Acts, not the whole story, a whole lot of the book of Acts from this moment, this is chapter 2 in Acts when the Spirit comes among the disciples in this way. The rest of that story, so much of it is the disciples suddenly realizing, oh, when God said to proclaim the love of God across boundaries of division, God also meant these people. Or God did not put a limitation on these people. Or God did not say just to these people. And so over and over and over again, the disciples find themselves in a new position to proclaim the love of God across a boundary of division. And it works. It works. It's filled with grace, and it's because of the Spirit that's working alongside us. The last several weeks, we've been talking about the Spirit that works alongside us. The Paraclete. If you've been here for a couple weeks, remember that L that is there. Paraclete. The Paraclete that is literally called to be alongside us. And we've named some of the work of this Spirit, the Spirit of God, to give us peace. But not peace as the world gives, peace like Christ gives, which doesn't mean that the things that cause us to be filled with conflict or worry or whatever are suddenly going to disappear. In fact, we should almost exchange the word peace for the word resolve. The world is going to be a difficult place, filled with cause for division. I will give you the resolve to cross boundaries of division as you proclaim my never-ending and never-failing love. That's the work of the Spirit. And the work of the Spirit has been called alongside you to gain clarity about God's purpose in your life, to draw you toward conviction. It moves you from a place of mere belief as an intellectual thing into a place of action extending from that belief. That conviction, moving to action, will draw you into work that looks like love. And the more we do it, the more we'll be doing it together, because God's purpose is for us to do it together. How's it going? What happened, part of the miracle on the Feast of Pentecost, is that plenty of people who were coming for a pilgrimage, coming to go to church, so to speak, suddenly got caught up in the movement of a Spirit that was trying to drive them to be the church. My prayer for all of us, whether this is our first time here today or if we've been here for decades, each of us has this thing that happens in our lives where sometimes we come to church just to come to church. Maybe out of holy obligation. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe out of routine. Maybe just trying to see if something's going to be different, but my prayer is this, that the Spirit of God will come among us and work in us and alongside us with the same power that it's been working in the church for all these thousands of years. And that each of us will go forth from this place to be the church. The Spirit will work in us in such a way that we did not just come to church today, that we go forth from this place today being the church. And what does the church do? It proclaims the loving work of God across boundaries of division. The Spirit has been given to you as a gift to help you do it. Holy Spirit, come among us and bring us your joy and your peace and your love. Bring us your power to shape your church, shape the heart of each individual here such that we don't just come to church today, that we are given every grace we need to go forth from this place to be the church in the world that you would have us be. Continuing in the work of Christ, proclaiming your never failing and never ending love across every boundary of division. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.